What if curiosity went too far? What if a teenager decided to experiment with something most scientists wouldn't even attempt alone? This is the story of David Hahn, a boy who didn't just love science. He became obsessed with it. At first, nothing about him seemed unusual. He was a regular teenager. He went to school, spent time at home, and like many kids his age, he was part of the Boy Scouts. But there was one thing that made him different. He didn't just read about science. He wanted to prove it. It started small, simple chemistry experiments, basic reactions you might see in a classroom. But for him, that wasn't enough. He wanted more. More complexity, more danger, more discovery. So he began building his own lab. At first, it was just a few items. Glass containers, household chemicals, basic tools. But slowly, that small setup turned into something much bigger. He read everything he could find. Textbooks, manuals, scientific papers, even documents that were never meant for beginners. He didn't just memorize information, he tried to recreate it. As time passed, his experiments became more intense. Stronger reactions, higher risks, and less supervision. What started as curiosity was turning into something else. Eventually, his activities became too dangerous for his bedroom, so the setup was moved downstairs, into the basement, a place where fewer people would notice, a place where he could work without interruption. That's where things began to change, because this is the moment when his interest shifted from chemistry to something far more dangerous: nuclear science. For most people, this topic is distant, complicated, something handled only by experts in controlled environments. But for him, it became a challenge. Through his involvement in the Boy Scouts, he earned a badge related to atomic science. For many, that would be the end of it. A simple achievement, a line on a record. But for him, it was only the beginning. He didn't just want to understand nuclear reactions. He wanted to create one. And that decision changed everything. Building something like that requires materials. Not ordinary materials, not things you can easily find. But somehow, he started collecting them. Small amounts at first. Items that didn't seem suspicious. Everyday objects that contained tiny traces of radioactive elements. Things most people would never think twice about. Piece by piece, he gathered what he needed, learning as he went, experimenting, adjusting, improving. Eventually, he moved everything again. This time, outside, into a small backyard shed. From the outside, it looked harmless, just an ordinary structure. Nothing unusual, nothing dangerous. But inside, it was a different story. Equipment, containers, improvised tools, and a setup that was slowly becoming more unstable. He worked alone, late hours, carefully following procedures he had only read about, trying to replicate processes meant for professionals. And slowly, something started happening. The energy levels inside that small space began to rise. Not in a dramatic explosion. Not all at once, but gradually, quietly, dangerously. Radiation. Invisible, odorless, but incredibly powerful. And he was getting closer to something he didn't fully understand. At this point, the situation had already gone too far. But no one knew. No one was watching. No one realized what was happening in that backyard. Until one night, everything changed. Authorities became aware. Suspicion grew. And eventually, they decided to investigate. What they found was shocking. A teenager, a backyard shed, and traces of radioactive activity far beyond what should ever exist in a place like that. The area had to be secured. Special teams were called in, people trained to handle dangerous materials. Because this was no longer just a strange hobby, it was a serious hazard. The structure was dismantled, materials were removed, and the entire situation was treated as a potential threat, not because of bad intentions, but because of how far things had gone. In the end, he didn't successfully build a fully functional nuclear reactor, but he got closer than anyone expected, especially for someone his age. And that's what makes this story so unsettling. It wasn't about crime. It wasn't about destruction. It was about curiosity without limits. The desire to understand something so deeply that you ignore the risks. Because sometimes knowledge without boundaries can be just as dangerous as ignorance. This story raises a question, a simple one, but an important one. How far is too far? Because curiosity can lead to incredible discoveries, but in the wrong direction. It can also lead to consequences no one is prepared for. And in this case, it almost did. All of it started with a simple interest in science and ended with something much bigger. Something that serves as a reminder that not all experiments should be done alone and not all knowledge is safe to chase, especially when you don't fully understand what you're dealing with. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing is not what you build, but how close you get to something you were never meant to control.